She was 34 years old, and she had exactly $41 to her name when the county sheriff nailed the eviction notice to the door of the only home she had ever loved. Cyrus Belhaven, president of the Prairie Vale Trust and Savings Bank, had called her late husband's note 11 days after the funeral, saying grief was no excuse for a debt gone quiet. With her $41 folded twice in a handkerchief, she did the one foolish, desperate thing left to a woman with nowhere to sleep and nothing to lose. She walked into the bank's own auction and paid $9 for a padlock key, and $3 more for the deed itself, to a burned-out, boarded-up saloon on the wrong end of town that no one else in Prairie Vale would touch with a 10-foot pole. $12 for a building folks said was cursed. But sealed behind that saloon's warped old bar was something that had waited 26 years to be found. Something that would not only change one widow's fortune, but would quietly, patiently, put right a wrong that had been done to an entire town. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Josephine Calloway. If you're watching this from a place that others have written off as worthless, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We'd love to know. There's a particular kind of steadiness that comes to a person who learns early that hard times pass through a household the way weather passes over a field, leaving something behind if you know how to look for it. And that steadiness was the truest inheritance Josephine Calloway ever received. Josephine Calloway had not been born to hardship. She had been born Josephine in Rayburn in the spring of 1855 in a modest clapboard house at the edge of a Missouri River town, the second of 4 daughters to a cooper named Eli Rayburn, a man who built barrels with the patience of a monk and taught his girls that a thing was never truly ruined so long as a person was willing to look at it twice. Josephine could remember, even as a very small child, standing at her father's elbow in the cooperage while he ran his thumb along a stave that another man had thrown onto the scrap pile, declaring it split beyond use. Her father would turn in the light, feel for the grain, and more often than not, he would nod to himself and set it aside to be planed down and used again. Nothing is finished being useful, he told her once, when she was no older than 7, until somebody decides it is. And a great many folks decide too quickly. It was a small lesson, delivered without ceremony, but it planted itself in her the way the best lessons do, quietly, and grew roots she would not fully understand until she was a grown woman standing in the ashes of her own life. Her mother, Constance, had a gift of a different kind. She could take a pot of near-nothing, a heel of bread, a few withered onions, the tough end of a ham bone, and turn it by supper time into something a family could sit down to with dignity. Josephine learned at her mother's stove the way she had learned at her father's workbench, that scarcity was not the same thing as ruin, and that a resourceful pair of hands could stretch what little there was into something that fed more than just the stomach. It fed a family's sense that they had not been defeated. By the time Josephine was 17, she could keep books for her father's business, negotiate with lumber suppliers twice her age without flinching, nurse a sick calf back onto its feet, and calculate interest on a loan faster than most of the men who worked at the county bank. She was, by every account of those who knew her then, formidably capable and entirely unassuming about it, which was its own kind of strength. She met Thomas Calloway at a barn raising in the autumn of 1873 when she was 18. Thomas was a quiet, sun-browned young man from a homesteading family out west in Wyoming Territory, visiting Missouri relatives, and he watched Josephine organize 40 exhausted men and women into an efficient supper line with the calm authority of someone twice her age, and he later told her he had decided within the hour that he intended to marry her, if she would have him. She would have him. They married the following spring and made the long journey west together to a modest 160 acres outside the young township of Prairie Vale, Wyoming Territory, where Thomas's family had already broken ground. It was hard country, dry in summer and merciless in winter, but Josephine took to it the way she took to most things, not with complaint, but with the quiet, unglamorous work of making a hard place livable. She and Thomas built a life there across 14 years. They raised wheat and a small herd of cattle. They built a home with their own 4 hands. They buried one infant daughter in a plot beneath a cottonwood tree and grieved her together in the particular silent partnership of 2 people who trust each other completely, and they never had another child, though they never stopped hoping. Josephine kept the farm's books with the same precision her father had taught her, and more than once it was her steady arithmetic, not Thomas's optimism, that kept them solvent through a bad season. The town of Prairie Vale, in those years, was a real community. A general store, a schoolhouse, a modest church, a scattering of homesteads, and at its center, oddly enough, a two-story saloon and boarding house called the Silver Anchor, run by a weathered old prospector-turned-publican named Silas Pruitt, a man who had struck a small vein of silver in his youth, lost most of it to bad partners, and settled in Prairie Vale determined, he used to say, to build something that couldn't be swindled out from under him twice. Silas Pruitt died the winter Josephine was 28, alone, with no known kin, and the Silver Anchor was shuttered by the bank that held its note and never reopened. It sat that way, boarded and forgotten, for the better part of a decade, a landmark of failure at the edge of town that children dared each other to run past after dark. Nobody thought of it as anything but an eyesore. Certainly nobody thought of it as an inheritance. The fall, when it came the way these things often do, not all at once, but in a slow accumulation of bad luck dressed up as bad decisions. A drought settled over the Wyoming plains in 1885 and did not properly break for 3 years. Thomas, determined not to lose the herd, took a loan against the homestead from the newly established Prairie Vale Trust and Savings Bank, whose president, a smooth, ambitious man named Cyrus Belhaven, had arrived in town 2 years prior from back east with capital, confidence, and a way of smiling that never quite reached his eyes. Belhaven made the loan easily, almost eagerly, at terms that seemed reasonable enough on paper, and for 2 years Josephine and Thomas scraped and struggled and made every payment on time, selling off stock they could not afford to sell, tightening a household that had little slack left to tighten. Then, in the bitter January of 1888, Thomas went out in a whiteout to bring in a calving heifer that had wandered from the barn, and he did not come back. They found him 2 days later, half a mile from the house, frozen against a fence line he had likely been trying to follow home in the dark. Josephine buried her husband beside their daughter under the cottonwood tree, and she had 11 days, to grieve before Cyrus Belhaven himself rode out to the homestead, expressed his very great sympathies, and informed her that with the primary note holder deceased and the loan technically in a state of irregularity, the bank would be calling the debt due in full within 30 days, in accordance, he said, with the fine print of the original agreement. Josephine had read that fine print herself, years before, and she did not remember it saying any such thing, but she had no money for a lawyer, no husband to stand beside her, and no neighbors willing to cross a man who held half the paper in the county. Word in town, quietly passed, was that Belhaven had done this before to a widow 2 counties over, and that he had a particular appetite for land held by women alone. Josephine could not prove it. She could only watch, over the following weeks, as everything she and Thomas had built with 14 years of frozen mornings and sunburned afternoons was itemized, appraised, and scheduled for the bank's spring auction block. She sold what furniture she could to neighbors too poor to pay her what it was worth, packed what remained into a single trunk, and on the morning the sheriff came to post a notice, she stood on the porch of her own home for the last time and watched a life disappear the way frost disappears off a window pane, quietly, completely, and with nothing anyone could do to stop it. She had $41. She took a room for a week above the mercantile, paying by the day, and she sat with her ledger book, the same steady, careful hand her father had taught her, and did arithmetic that offered her no comfort at all. $41 would not buy passage back to Missouri and support her once she arrived. It would not rent a decent room in Prairie Vale for more than a month or 2. It would not, by any reasonable calculation, buy her a future. And so, on the day of the bank's own auction, the same auction floor where her homestead's furnishings had been sold off piece by piece, Josephine sat in the back row and watched Cyrus Belhaven's clerk work through a list of foreclosed and abandoned properties the bank was eager to be rid of, tax burdens more than assets, and near the very bottom of that list, offered almost as an afterthought, was a parcel described simply as Former Silver Anchor Saloon and outbuildings, condition poor. Sold as is. Not one soul in the room raised a hand. The auctioneer called for a bid twice, received silence twice, and was moving on when Josephine, with a boldness that surprised even her, lifted her hand and offered $3 for the deed. There was some laughter. The clerk, eager to clear the property from the bank's books, gavelled it down before Bellhaven, seated at the front, had even fully turned around, and Josephine paid $3 for the deed and, separately, $9 to a locksmith who happened to still hold the old padlock key from when the bank had first sealed the building, for want of anyone else who'd ever asked for it. $12 total. She walked out of that auction house with $29 left in the world, and the deed to a building most of Prairie Vale considered not merely worthless, but faintly unlucky, the sort of place respectable folks crossed the street to avoid. She went to see it that same afternoon, alone, with the iron key heavy in her coat pocket. The Silver Anchor stood at the edge of town where the last real street gave way to open prairie. A two-story clapboard structure gone gray and silver with a decade of weather, its windows boarded, its porch sagging on one corner like a man favoring a bad hip. Dust and dead leaves had drifted into corners of the entryway when she finally worked the stubborn padlock free and pushed the door open on hinges that screamed in protest. Inside, the air was thick and still and smelled of old wood, mouse droppings, and the ghost of spilled whiskey soaked so deep into the floorboards that a decade of abandonment had not lifted it. Cobwebs hung in gray sheets from the rafters. Chairs sat overturned as though the last patrons had simply vanished mid-drink. And along the back wall, running the length of the room, stood the bar itself, a long, handsome piece of black walnut, scarred and dulled with neglect, but unmistakably the work of a craftsman who had cared about what he built, with a carved rail along its front edge and a mirror behind it, cracked in one corner, that still caught what little light came through the gaps in the boarded windows. Josephine stood in the doorway a long moment, taking in the ruin of it, and felt, absurdly, something less like despair than recognition. It was exactly the kind of thing her father would have turned over in his hands and refused to throw away. She began, in the days that followed, sweeping and clearing with the same unglamorous determination she had once brought to a drought-stricken wheat field, because the truth was simpler than pride allowed her to admit. She had nowhere else to go, and a roof, even a leaking, cobwebbed one, was still a roof. It was on the fourth day, while she was on her knees scrubbing years of grime from the base of that long walnut bar, that her cloth caught on something that should not have been there, a seam in the wood, too straight, too deliberate, hidden along the underside of the bar's front paneling, where a casual I would never think to look. She worked her fingers along it, found the edge of a small hidden panel fitted with craftsman's precision, and after several minutes of careful prying, it gave way with a soft, dry groan, revealing a shallow compartment built into the very frame of the bar. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle and yellow with age, she found a leather ledger book, a bundle of letters tied with wax twine, and a small tin box that rattled faintly when she lifted it. Her hands, she would later admit, were shaking, not from fear, but from the particular electricity of a person who senses, before she can prove it, that she has stumbled onto something that matters. She did not open everything at once. She was careful, methodical, the way her father had taught her to be careful with anything fragile and old. She carried the bundle to the one clean table in the room, lit the stub of a candle she had brought with her, and began, gently, to unwrap the oilcloth. The ledger book, when she opened its cover, bore a name written in a firm, deliberate hand. Silas Pruitt, proprietor, and beneath it, a date, 1863. The year, she would later learn, the Silver Anchor had first opened its doors, a full quarter-century before her own hands touched its walnut bar. The first pages were unremarkable, columns of ordinary tavern accounts, whiskey purchased and sold, rooms let, wages paid to a cook and a stable hand. But as she turned further into the book, the entries changed in character. And it was there, in that dim and dusty room, with dust motes turning slow in her candlelight, that Josephine Calloway began to understand that Silas Pruitt's saloon had been keeping a second set of secrets far longer than anyone in Prairie Vale had ever suspected. The deepening of the mystery came slowly, over the following days, as Josephine returned again and again to the ledger and the letters, piecing together a history that predated her own arrival in Prairie Vale by more than a decade. What she found was this. In the early 1860s, before the township had even properly incorporated, a small band of prospectors and homesteading families, 31 households in all, the ledger recorded by name, had pooled their modest savings into what they called the Prairie Vale Miners and Settlers Aid Society, a mutual fund meant to see the fledgling community through hard winters, failed crops, and the inevitable emergencies of frontier life. Silas Pruitt, trusted by the founding families for his blunt honesty and his own hard-won understanding of how easily a man could be swindled, had been chosen as the society's keeper, and the silver anchor, new built that same year, had been constructed with this secret purpose folded into its very bones, the hidden compartment behind the bar built by Pruitt himself as a place to hold the society's ledger in its. Accumulating gold, safer, he reasoned, in a public place hidden in plain sight than in any single family's vulnerable home. For nearly 2 years, the fund grew steadily, a modest but real cushion against catastrophe, until the letters told Josephine what the ledger's numbers alone could not fully explain, that in 1865, a banker newly arrived in the territory, a man the letters named only as B, had approached Pruitt with an offer to formalize and safeguard the society's funds through his new bank, promising better interest and proper legal protection than an old saloon keeper's hidden drawer could provide. Pruitt, the letters revealed in his own increasingly agitated hand, had refused, distrusting the man's manner from the start, and within the year, a series of unexplained irregularities had been used to discredit Pruitt publicly, accusing him, falsely, the ledger's careful accounting made plain, of having mismanaged or absconded with society funds himself. Ashamed and unable to disprove a rumor cleverly seeded through a town too young to have its own newspaper or proper records, Pruitt had quietly sealed the society's true ledger and its remaining gold behind his bar, told no one but a single trusted friend the location, and spent the rest of his life running a modest, honest tavern under the shadow of a reputation he had not deserved, waiting, the last letter suggested, for a day when the truth could safely come out, a day that never arrived. Before his death, the tin box, when Josephine finally worked its rusted latch free, held not the full fortune the ledger accounted for, but a smaller cache of gold coin, roughly $400 worth, along with a hand-drawn map marking a second, larger cache Pruitt had buried beneath the floor of the old stable behind the saloon for safekeeping against exactly the kind of failure that had ultimately taken him. A betrayal by the very banking establishment the town had come to trust. And there, in the ledger's final pages, in Pruitt's own unmistakable hand, was a name Josephine recognized instantly, a name that made the candle seem to gutter though no draft had touched it. The banker he had refused, the man the letters called simply B, was recorded once, fully, in an early entry before Pruitt had grown cautious enough to abbreviate it, Bartholomew Belhaven, Cyrus Belhaven's own father. Josephine sat a long while with that knowledge, turning it over the way her father had once turned a discarded stave in his hands, feeling for the grain of it, understanding slowly the full shape of what she now held. She read the entry 3 times over by candlelight, half expecting the name to rearrange itself into something less consequential, but did not, and somewhere in that quiet, dust-hung room, she felt the particular vertigo of a person watching 2 separate griefs, 26 years apart, reveal themselves as branches of the very same tree. It was not simply a windfall. It was proof, decades old but still legible, that the very institution which had swindled her and Thomas out of their homestead had been built, in part, on an earlier and crueler swindle against 31 founding families of Prairie Vale, families whose descendants still lived quietly in that town, many of them never knowing why the society's promised safety net had simply vanished from memory a generation ago, absorbed into local legend as one more hard-luck story of the frontier. She thought of her father's hands on that scrap pile stave. Nothing is finished being useful until somebody decides it is. She understood, sitting in that dusty room with a dead man's ledger open before her, that she had been handed something far larger than a personal fortune, and that what she did with it would matter to more people than herself. She did not act rashly. She spent the following weeks quietly verifying what the ledger claimed, cross-referencing the 31 founding names against Prairie Vale's church registry and the county's old land records, which she was permitted to examine at the small territorial land office 2 towns over, and she found, name after name, that the society's original members or their surviving children were still very much alive and living, in many cases, in modest circumstances that a restored inheritance would meaningfully change. The Hendersons, whose eldest son had lost a hand in a threshing accident and could no longer farm. The widow Okafor, formerly Odom by marriage, who took in laundry to feed 4 children since her husband's death. Old Ezra Whitcomb, whose family had helped found the very church Prairie Vale still worshipped in, and who now lived above his own failing cobbler's shop. She also confirmed, through careful, patient inquiry at the county courthouse, that the Prairie Vale Trust and Savings Bank had been established formally in 1867 with founding capital that, by the dates and figures recorded, aligned troublingly well with the timeline of Silas Pruitt's public disgrace, as though the very capital that built Cyrus Belhaven's father's bank had been, in some considerable part, the town's own vanished trust fund, laundered through respectability and time. It was not a case she could prove in a courtroom without more, but it was more than enough to know, in her own steady conscience, exactly what needed to be done and exactly who would not want it done. Word travels quickly in a small town, and it was not long before whispers reached Cyrus Belhaven that the widow Calloway had been seen carrying old papers between the abandoned Silver Anchor and the county land office with unusual purpose. Belhaven, never a man to leave uncertainty unexamined, called on Josephine himself one gray afternoon, standing on the sagging porch of the Silver Anchor with his hat in his hands and that same smile that never reached his eyes, offering, with elaborate courtesy, to purchase the old saloon back from her outright, at a price he called generous, $300, a sum that would have seemed a fortune to a woman with $29 to her name only weeks earlier, but which Josephine now understood, with the ledger's true figures fresh in her mind, was a fraction of what the property actually concealed. She declined, politely but firmly, and watched something harden behind Belhaven's eyes before he collected himself and departed with a warning thinly disguised as advice, that a woman alone, running a disreputable old saloon with no husband and no standing, would find Prairie Vale a difficult place to make a living, and that the bank held paper on most every business and household in town, should any of them be tempted to extend her credit or custom. It was, Josephine understood perfectly well, a threat, and in the days that followed she felt its teeth. The lumber yard suddenly unwilling to extend her an account, the general store's proprietor apologizing awkwardly as he explained he could not be seen supplying that place. A pair of Belhaven's associates spreading quiet talk in the church pews that the widow Calloway had gone strange with grief, taking up residence in a cursed saloon and speaking of buried treasure like a woman not entirely in her right mind. Josephine felt the old, familiar sting of being underestimated, dismissed, written off exactly as the town had once written off the very building she now stood inside. And she felt, too, the harder edge resolve that comes to a person who has already lost everything once and finds she is no longer quite so afraid of losing it again. There were harder moments than the lumber yard's refusal and the general store's apologies, moments Josephine would not soon forget. One night in late winter, she woke to the smell of coal oil and found that someone had tried, clumsily and without much conviction, to set a fire against the Silver Anchor's back wall near the stable. The very stable, though the arsonist could not have known it, that held Pruitt's second and larger cache still buried and undiscovered beneath its floor. The fire caught poorly in the damp night air, and Josephine beat it out herself with a wet feed sack before it had done more than blacken the boards. And though no one was ever charged, and Belhaven expressed shocked, elaborate sympathy when he heard of it the following day, Josephine noted quietly that he seemed less surprised than a man ought to be at news of an attack on a building he had no stake in. She did not confront him. She had learned enough, by then, of how power protected itself in a small town, to know that accusation without proof would only cost her what little standing she had left. Instead, she doubled her caution, moved the ledger and the letters to a hiding place of her own choosing each night, and kept her own counsel about how far along her investigation had actually come, letting Belhaven and his associates believe, for a while longer, that the widow Calloway was a nuisance to be managed rather than a genuine threat to be feared. It was a hard, lonely stretch of weeks, made bearable mostly by small, unlooked-for kindnesses. The widow Okafor leaving a loaf of bread on the Silver Anchor's swept porch without a word of explanation, old Ezra Whitcomb tipping his hat to her in the street when others crossed to the far side, a silent but growing current of townsfolk who remembered, even if they would not yet say so aloud, that Josephine Calloway had never once given them reason to doubt her honesty, while Cyrus Belhaven's smile, on reflection, had always been a touch too practiced to entirely trust. She made her decision on a cold evening in early spring, sitting once more at that same table with Pruitt's ledger open before her, and it was not a decision born of anger, though she had earned the right to some. She decided that the society's fortune, hidden and buried and full and true, was never rightfully hers alone to spend, that it belonged, as it always had, to the town Silas Pruitt had built it to protect, and that the surest justice she could deliver to Cyrus Belhaven was not vengeance, but simple, undeniable, public truth. She wrote, in her own careful hand, letters to each of the 31 founding families or their surviving descendants, inviting them to a meeting at the Silver Anchor on a Sunday afternoon when the church service let out in the town would already be gathered close. And she wrote, separately, to the Territorial Bank Examiner's office in Cheyenne, enclosing a careful summary of the ledger's dates and figures alongside the county's own bank charter records, and asking, in the plainest terms she could manage, whether an examiner might find it worth a visit to Prairie Vale. The examiner arrived 9 days later, a dry, unhurried man named Mr. Adler, who introduced himself to Belhaven as making a routine review of the territory's smaller banks and asked, with polite and terrible patience, to see the Prairie Vale Trust and Savings Bank's original 1867 founding ledgers, a request Belhaven could not refuse without arousing precisely the suspicion he most wished to avoid. That same Sunday, in the Silver Anchor's main room, swept clean now, its windows unboarded, sunlight falling for the first time in a decade across that long walnut bar, Josephine stood before some 40 townspeople, descendants of the society's founding families among them, and read aloud from Silas Pruitt's ledger the true history of the fund their grandparents and parents had built and lost and never understood the losing of. She showed them the letters. She showed them the map. She led a small party of the town's older men out to the stable behind the saloon, where, beneath 3 feet of hard-packed earth, exactly where Pruitt's hand-drawn map indicated, they found second. Heavier cash, gold and silver coin totaling, once properly counted and appraised in Cheyenne the following week, just over $6,000, an almost unthinkable sum for that place and time, grown modestly through Pruitt's own careful early stewardship before it had ever been hidden away. And she told them, plainly and without embellishment, whose father had driven Silas Pruitt to that hiding place to begin with, and whose bank, examined now by Mr. Adler's careful eye, would in the following weeks be found to carry founding-era irregularities serious enough that Cyrus Belhaven would be quietly, thoroughly stripped of his charter and his position, his family's long-standing respectability in Prairie Vale unraveling not through any act of Josephine's revenge, but through the simple, patient weight of a truth that had waited 26 years to be spoken aloud in daylight. Josephine did not keep the gold. She had thought, in the earliest days after finding it, of what $6,000 might mean for a widow with $29 to her name, a fine house, a comfortable life, a permanent escape from the hard, uncertain work of building something from nothing. But she thought, too, of her father's hands turning a discarded stave, and of her mother stretching a heel of bread into a supper a family could be proud of, and she understood that the truest use of what she had found was not to hoard it for herself, but to return it, with interest and with dignity, to the town it had always belonged to. Working alongside a small committee of the founding family's descendants, she saw the society's restored fund distributed according to Pruitt's own careful original accounting. Enough to the Hendersons that their son could hire help for the farm his ruined hand could no longer manage alone. Enough to the widow Okafor that she could open a proper little dress shop instead of taking in other women's laundry. Enough to old Ezra Whitcomb that his cobbler's shop was repaired and resupplied in his family's name, tied so long to the town's founding church, restored to something like its old standing. And Josephine herself, at the committee's insistent and unanimous request, kept the silver anchor, repaired, repainted, its walnut bar polished back to its old handsome shine. Not as a saloon any longer, but as Prairie Vale's first proper public hall and mercantile exchange, a place where a town could gather, trade fairly, and remember, carved now into a small brass plaque above that same long bar, the name of Silas Pruitt, keeper of a trust he never broke, and the story of how a widow with $12 and a foolish, desperate purchase had finally set it right. And so we return, as we always do, to where we began, to a 34-year-old widow standing in the wreckage of a life the bank had taken from her, with $41 folded in a handkerchief and nowhere left to turn. We told you then that what she bought for $12, out of desperation more than hope, held something sealed away that would change her life and restore a whole community. And now you understand what that was. Not merely gold, though there's gold enough, but a decades-old debt of trust finally repaid, a false accusation finally lifted from a dead man's name, and a town's quiet, collective faith in itself finally restored. Josephine Calloway did not set out to become anyone's hero. She set out only to survive, the way she had been taught to survive, by looking twice at what other people had thrown away and asking, patiently, whether it was truly as worthless as they believed. It rarely was. That, in the end, is the whole of her story, and perhaps the whole of its lesson too. That value does not vanish simply because it has been forgotten, and that the people the world writes off too quickly are so very often the ones who see most clearly what everyone else has missed. Thank you for spending this time with us, and with Josephine, this evening. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you have a moment, leave it a like so more folks can find their way to Prairie Vale. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell us about a time when you, or someone you knew, found real value in something the rest of the world had already written off. Until next time, stay close.